Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Jawad Tehami. The United States is the worst hit country by COVID-19 pandemic, with the death toll crossing 40,000 and over 750,000 infections. However, people in many states have taken to the streets to protest against the stay-at-home measures imposed by the majority of the state governors. President Donald Trump seems anxious about reopening the businesses and returning to normality, as he tweeted to liberate some states. His tweets have earned him some criticism by some governors, especially Washington's governor, accusing the president of fomenting domestic rebellion and spreading lies. Similar sort of presidential behavior by Jair Bolsonaro can be witnessed in Brazil, where hundreds of people have also protested against the lockdown measures, which have rattled the country's economy. And to talk more about this, we are today joined by Professor Herbert Reginbogin, international law expert from Washington, D.C., and Elizabeth Laura, professor of political science and international affairs at the University of Mary Washington from Virginia. Thank you for your time at Newswire. I'll start the discussion with you, Professor Reginbogin. Protests have been reported in the streets of Ohio, Texas, North Carolina, Kentucky, Virginia, and Michigan, with thousands have turned out. How do you think legit are these protests?
They have a constitutional right to protest, but in a state of emergency, which is quasi been called out by their governor, it becomes a question of which right prevails over the other. If this was to be brought before a court, I think that the merits of a state of emergency would prevail. However, that not being the case, and a president giving legitimacy for these kinds of actions is almost an incitement of breaking the law. This is still very fluid, but if this continues in a larger form, then I believe there will be legal action taken by the court and by organizations, because this is about the public health.
This is about public health, and if you think that continues with such type of narrative, there would be a legal action against him in a future. Professor Laura, how legitimate do you think these protests are? It actually owes to the anxiety and the frustration that has been caused among the Americans generally, because there are reports that over 22 million Americans have lost their jobs because of the lockdown measures.
In the United States, we do have a constitutional right to assembly and to express our opinion. So these people showing up for the protests are carrying out their rights. Now, some of the protests have been quite large. In Denver, thousands of people showed up. In Virginia, and in some other states, a handful of people showed up. So when you're talking about demonstrations and protests, they're not all the same. And in some places, actually in many places, these were carried out in cars. People drove their cars and honked their horns to show visibility, and so they could be heard, in the state houses. So they weren't even getting out of their cars. In other places, people were 6 feet apart. And yes, in other places, people were less than 6 feet apart. And that is, a contradiction to what the governors have been saying. But what these people coming out and protesting are saying, and again, they're not really the majority of Americans. I know some polls say about 60% of Americans agree with the decisions of the governors to keep these limits. But these people who are showing up are saying that they're chafing against the powers of the state, and especially the more egregious actions that some state governors have taken, such as you can't go fishing, you cannot be alone in a park or a dog park. It's those kinds of things. And also some of the businesses are saying we are going to lose our livelihoods because your decisions are egregious. That's the primary argument, that the governors have gone too far, not that there is some type of limits at all.
Okay, so Reginbogin, do you agree with this particular thing which has been mentioned by Professor Laura, that there are certain governors which have gone too far in implementing these lockdown measures? For example, a person roaming around in a certain park, he's not allowed to do so. And keeping the number of people which are getting unemployed, that proportion is quite huge as compared to the number of infections in the country. 22 million Americans losing their jobs. So what do you say about this?
If the President of the United States declares this a war, and the governors have the responsibility to protect the public welfare of the population, then this frames the state of emergency. If this is a state of emergency as an interpretation by court, then those override and constrict and limit, like habeas corpus or any other type of right within the Constitution, because of that overriding measure under conditions of war or of protecting the public welfare. Now, that is an interpretation, but I believe the courts would side with the governors or any other enforcement if that should develop into a larger demonstration. I agree that staying in the car limits such exposure. But if social distancing is not being upheld, and that is in very many cases the fact, and that leads the country to believe that it can do and take such action, then I believe you're going to find that those rights, which are constitutionally provided, have a very, very limited ability to be performed by citizens because of the reasons of public health welfare.
Okay, Professor Reginbogin, I'll come back to you with certain different points. That was actually a certain tweet to liberate certain states in the US by President Trump actually added fuel to fire in instigating those protests. We are now joined by Mr. Tim Kirby, who is a political analyst and a radio show host, joining us from Moscow. Thank you for your time at Newswire. We are discussing that how legitimate are the protests which are happening in the United States amid the lockdown measures to contain the spread of the virus in the country?
Well, legitimacy depends on how you look at it, because pretty much in every constitutional republic on the planet, it's been accepted and agreed on that when there's an emergency situation, all of our rights, which are in theory inalienable, disappear and vanish temporarily. So if you look at it from the standpoint of some statist person who loves to look at legality, then the protests seem irrational because in a crisis, your rights don't matter. However, from someone who might look at things from a more moral standpoint and see that that maybe their rights come from some sort of higher source, well, it does seem to be a bit too much what's going on right now, because from the public's perspective, there don't seem to be that many people sick and dying. Again, perspective, not statistics, perspective. There don't seem to be that many people getting sick and dying. Everyone's trapped at home. People are losing their jobs. The economies around the world are starting to slip a bit, feels bad, and people just feel they've had enough of it, and they don't feel they've been explained the reason why they need to vastly, seriously alter their lives and maybe even lose their jobs.
Okay, Professor Laura, what do you think? President Donald Trump has repeatedly called for the earliest possible return to normality. Already we had seen that he was accused and criticized of downplaying the threat of the virus and its spread in the country. And do you think that his tweets have actually added fuel to fire in flaring up the protests in different states?
President Trump has proposed a three-step process in reopening the country. So he is saying that he wants to reopen. He would rather reopen sooner rather than later. But reopening is contingent on doing more testing. Somewhere between 2 and 5 million Americans have been tested. Now, out of a population of 330 million, and again, you're not going to test everyone, but we still have a ways to go with the testing. But what he is saying is, you keep the social distancing, you keep the self-quarantining, and then with testing, And when the hot spots begin to level off, as we are starting to see in New York, New Jersey, some of the other places, then there can be some restrictions, it's easing of restrictions. And the governors, again, we have a federal system of government. The governments, in their own discretion, can decide, what stage loosening of restrictions, I suppose, they want to go to. They want to keep lockdown. They want to allow places to open, but limit it to like 50 guests, at a time. I believe that's the second stage, opening, but having limited limited numbers of people gathering. And then the final one is open things up, but still have the social distancing. But I do want to get back to this concept of war. The president does not have the right to declare war. Congress has not declared war. We are not in a wartime situation. I am in the comfort of my home. I have my cell phone. I have my kids. I have my food. No one's bombing me. No one's attacking me. I have my pool in my backyard. And I can go out and I can walk around my neighborhood and I can walk my dog. So this is not wartime. By saying, the president declaring wartime does not mean that we need to suspend our Constitution because he says so. If this is really wartime, then sure, get Congress to declare war and then get everyone on board on this. But right now, there's a real difference of opinion in this country as to where we are in the status of this crisis.
Professor Laura, as you just mentioned, President Trump has unveiled a three-phase plan of bringing the country back to normality. But this particular stance has been changing because earlier he has said that it was up to the state governors that whatever they give a call, whether they want to extend the lockdown or whatever the measures they want to take to curb the spread of the pandemic. And then later on, he gave the three-phase plan of bringing the normality. And then we saw a tweet that specifically talked about 3 states that include Minnesota, Michigan, and Virginia, about liberating them. How do you see this pattern in changing the stance from President Trump?
Well, keep in mind this is an election year. And the governors of these states that you mentioned are Democrats. And so, President Trump is very sensitive to the criticism that he has gotten of his handling of the situation. The Democrats saying he should have done things differently earlier when he actually, when he was one of the earliest leaders around the world to limit flights from China, right, coming into, a particular country. He got criticism for that. It was called a racist. So he comes out and he says, okay, this is what we're going to do. And then people say he's a dictator. And then he says, okay, we have a federal system of government. So you governors do what you think is best. Then they say, oh, he's not practicing leadership. And then he says, okay, I've got this 3-step plan. And then they say, well, it's going to be premature. So yes, President Trump is bouncing this ball around, but so are the governors and so are his political opposition. And so it's almost, I'm trying to think of the term, like a tit for tat, this tennis ball going back and forth, back and forth. And and so we're going to, especially in a political election year, we're going to see this ball being bounced back and forth and a lot of different comments being made by both the president and by governors and by, political opposition.
Okay, Professor Laura, I think President Trump would be gaining something out of this rhetoric because, as you mentioned, that the elections are very much around the corner in November. So this bouncing of the ball will be seen until that time. So do you think, is he gaining something out of this rhetoric?
If he's getting something, probably not much from talking about relaxing the restrictions, because I believe that the people who are showing up in protests are probably going to vote for him in the first place. So, you could say, oh, he's solidifying his political base, which is true, but he's probably got that base. By doing this, I don't know if he's going to bring over any independents. Look, the people who are against Trump are going to be against him in November. And so I don't think too many of these people out there protesting are Democrats, who said, I'm really going to switch my vote to Trump. He might get a few, but I don't think he's going to get a lot of political mileage out of this.
So you think not going to take a lot of political mileage out of this particular thing? Let me take this point to Professor Reginbogin. Do you think when he specifically, the President of the United States, targets 3 states that should be actually liberated, what do you think he might be taking away from here?
That depends on what the situation is in 6 months from now. If he opens up and there is a reemergence of this virus, then I would say that his presidency is certainly curtailed for one period. My point here is that this is a public health emergency, and as such, this has a very fluid situation which requires leadership. And if a president declares something and he gives the message to the public in very confusing and contradictory ways, that leads to a lot of liability for which the public emergency takes on greater credibility. And that issue, the credibility of his leadership, is going to be tested and is being tested right now in terms of how he leads the public calmly, pragmatically, and assures the safety of all Americans, not just in some sections. The disease has no walls and it has no borders. And if people don't realize that we don't know what we have in front of us, well, then we should look into the past of how that has been repeated in World War I, or in the Zika virus, or Ebola. We don't have enough knowledge of what we are facing with COVID-19. And so, to answer your question, there is really a calculation which is not to be made because we just don't know what we're facing and what will be the outcome by a public opening.
But Professor Reginbogin, sorry for the interruption, but there are reports that the number of infections and the number of fatalities in the hardest hit state, New York, has started decreasing. And there are certain states, other states, including Texas, Indiana, which have actually announced to allow some retailing and other activity to resume as well. Florida and South Carolina reopening beaches as well. So doesn't it mean that when President Trump talks about easing the restrictions or returning the country back to the normality, he is keeping that data or the number of reduced infections and the fatalities in New York?
I strongly believe that the lifestyle and the health need to be correlated in this opening. But I think what we don't realize is the mutation that we've already discovered a few days ago in New York of this virus. We don't give all that information to the public of what is occurring scientifically because it's very exponential. It's not yet realistically a scenario that you would want to share with the public. But the public safety and the scientists behind this know there are so many variables still open. We have not tested enough people. We don't know who's infected. We don't know how they are infected. Will they be reinfected by those who've had this illness? Sir, I believe we are in the dark as we try to rationally create programs because it is socially unsettling for many people, understandably, and for the livelihood and the economy. But that is why this is a state of emergency.
Okay, Professor Reginbogin, you're of the view that more stringent actions and the measures should be taken in order to curb the spread of the virus in the country, as there is little knowledge regarding what it actually is and how does it mutate. I'll come to you, Mr. Kirby. A similar sort of presidential behavior as we have seen in the United States by President Donald Trump. Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro has also opposed the lockdown measures. He earlier called it a little flu. How do you think that is playing out in Brazil? Because people have come out on the streets in that country as well.
Well, I didn't quite hear what you said, but I can say that Well, what are they going to do? Force people to stay at home in Brazil? Things sort of depend a little bit about your living situation, right? As someone who's located in Russia, which has the one of the highest rates of second home ownership, there's this whole tradition of people having dachas. Well, for the people that do have this sort of country house they can go to escape, that's great. However, if we're talking about the stereotypical Rio de Janeiro favela lifestyle that's projected in the media, well, those people are cramped together. If they're stuck at home in a very small home that they don't really enjoy being in very much, obviously there's going to be a limit of people's tolerance and patience. And furthermore, Brazil is very hot. And being locked indoors in the heat is probably also not particularly wonderful. So you have to understand that people eventually sort of meet their breaking point, but that really depends on some of the situations, and it also depends on the culture. So governments shouldn't be particularly surprised when their populace, when overall worldwide, this whole coronavirus situation has generally been very badly explained to the public, bad explanations, bad justifications, no good sell of the idea, and then they expect people to be completely obedient. Well, that's not the way the world works.
Okay, well, talking in terms of number of infections and fatalities in Brazil, which make only a fraction of the total population, do you think Brazilian president is right in saying when he says that the outbreak has been blown out of proportion and he fired his health minister as well?
I'm a media person, but I can tell you one thing is that, again, media is about perspectives. And if there is this tiny percent of people infected, it doesn't seem to the public any different than the usual flu season. Well, then, under that logic, then yes, it does seem that Brazil might want to just give up with this. But overall, for some reason, this time around, there was Ebola and the swine flu and I think there was a bird flu before that and so on and so forth. And this time around, there's a whole global panic and pretty much every government on earth is down with it. Well, it sort of leads one to wonder, when is this going to end? Don't we have projections? Why isn't anyone showing them to us? It should be pretty much understood to most governments when this is all going to be over. So I don't know. It really is up to the individual actors. But I really can neither praise nor criticize any leader for changing their mind about the severity of coronavirus, because that's not really their area of expertise.
Okay, one last question where it's not less important. Professor Reginbogin, when we talk about a certain virus coming and starting harming the society, and it is communicable, and we're still in a dark regarding its more details. So does that mean every time, let's suppose there is the supposition, if after 2 months or 6 months, another virus more deadly and more lethal than this COVID-19 appears on the horizon, does it mean we'll take the same drastic measures and we'll put the people again in the lockdown?
I think if you explain in very clear and calm detail what we are facing and what we know we are facing and potentially don't know, and illustrate this to people that is in the common humanitarian context of helping each other as Americans and others in living in this country, I think you will find that this has an overriding emotional and reasonable context for behavior. And I believe that it will be a self-imposed quarantine. People will take this very seriously, not as some kind of a violation of their constitutional rights, but understandably they need to accept this because this is what we are facing as a public emergency. This is a humanitarian crisis.
Okay, Professor Laura, with the same question, do you think every time a new virus appears on the horizon and starts affecting the society in a lethal way, even after 2 months or 6 months, nobody knows for exactly what is going to happen in future. So every time a virus appears in the society, we are going to take the drastic measures like locking down the people in their homes?
Well, again, it would have to be a very drastic situation as we have now. Not every, flu that comes down the road, of course. This certainly sets a precedent for future action. We would have to go back about 100 years in America to see a similar situation. The Spanish flu of 1918, 1919 where local governments did close down a lot of public spaces, movie theaters that existed at the time, public gathering places, the number of people were limited. What was really different, though, during the Spanish flu time is they did not close houses of worship. And a lot of the entities, there weren't as many restaurants, of course, in the United States then. So the scale of closure was not as large. And also most people were still working. Either they were off at war, they were sick, but most people were still working. So this situation is very different in that, wow, Americans are sitting at home, some working from home, but a lot of people have been tossed out of jobs. And I'm afraid that this sets a precedent for really drastic measures that, if this happens in any kind of regularity in the future, will really, really hurt the American economy and the global economy.
Thank you very much for your Professor Elizabeth Laura, Professor of Political Science and National Affairs at the University of Mary Washington, joined us from Virginia, and Professor Herbert Reginbogin, international law expert, joining us from Washington, D.C., and Mr. Tim Kirby, a political analyst and the radio show host, joining us from Moscow. With this, we come to the end of the first segment of the show. In the second segment, we'll discuss the clashes between Afghan forces and the Taliban have erupted once again, but after a short break, stay tuned. Welcome back to Newswire. I'm Jawad Tehami. During the last week, Afghan government and the Taliban started releasing some of each other's prisoners, which was seen as a hope for the Afghan peace process getting on track. But the fighting between the two resumed, which led to the eruption of the blame game again. Afghan Security Council spokesperson Jawad Tehami has accused the Taliban of capturing, torturing and killing the civilians. In a recent development, Afghan security forces claim to have retaken Humab district from the Taliban in Jawad province, killing 14 Taliban fighters. Is the Afghan peace process like a camel trying to pass through the eye of the needle? To talk about this, we are joined by Mr. Rahimullah Yusufzai, analyst, joining us from Peshawar. Thank you for your time at Newswire. First of all, when we talk about an initial phase of prisoner release, it was considered a sign of hope and the Afghan peace process would finally get back on track. But later on, we have seen the clashes erupting once again between the Afghan security forces and the Taliban. How do you think it will affect the prisoner release, which was already slow, in the coming days?
Yes, I agree. This has created hope when the peace agreement was signed on 29th of February, and then when it was announced in the deal that there would be an exchange of 6,000 prisoners. But now I think this issue has become a bone of contention. There is no agreement between the Taliban and the Afghan government as to when all these exchanges of prisoners will be completed. And until then, there would be no intra-Afghan negotiations, as Taliban have said. So I think that there are delays. I think initially it was very unrealistic on the part of the Americans to make a promise that the 5,000 Taliban prisoners would be released in exchange for 1,000 government prisoners held by Taliban by 10th of March, which means within 10 days after signing of the agreement. And that on the same day, 10th March, the intra-Afghan negotiations will start. But this was very ambitious, very unrealistic. So when you don't meet some targets, if you don't meet some deadlines, then it is natural there will be disappointment.
So, Mr. Yusufzai, how threatening do you think this particular eruption of the clashes once again between the Taliban and the Afghan security forces is for the overall peace process in Afghanistan and a permanent political solution over there in the war-torn country?
And that's why the U.S. officials have been meeting Taliban leaders in Qatar. They also visited Kabul and Islamabad. And the Americans, have to try and overcome this hurdle. Otherwise, I'm afraid the peace talks will not begin.
So we would be seeing the same state of affairs in Afghanistan, the conflict and the violence happening again in coming years?
Unless there are peace talks between Taliban, the Afghan government, and other Afghan groups, unless they begin talking and then they discuss the issue of a permanent ceasefire, I think the violence will continue. Taliban are justifying their attacks by saying there is no ceasefire yet. And Taliban also have to put pressure militarily on the Afghan government to get their prisoners released and also to force the Afghan government to accept their other demands. The Afghan government has got this card. They are holding Taliban prisoners, so they are trying to use that for persuading Taliban to reduce violence. I think that the violence will continue. That's why the Americans are saying violence should be reduced to create the right conditions for the peace talks. But I am afraid that there is no trust between the Americans and Taliban, and also between Taliban and the Afghan government. So there would be hurdles at every step, and there would be breakdowns. I don't expect any breakthrough in the near future.
Mr. Yusufzai, as you have mentioned, that the Taliban are justifying their attacks and violence on the fact that there isn't yet a complete ceasefire. But when it comes to the Afghan government and its security forces, they have been calling for a complete ceasefire in the country, and they had been urging the Taliban to observe a ceasefire, particularly amid the Covid-19 pandemic. So here is a development. The Afghan security forces have claimed to have retaken Humab district from the Taliban in Jawad province, killing 14 Taliban. So does it actually justify their urging the Taliban to observe a ceasefire and themselves carrying out the offensive against them?
That is the problem, you know. So the Americans have been calling for reduction in violence. In fact, this was one of their conditions before signing the peace agreement. And Taliban had accepted this condition and reduced violence for 1 week, from 22nd of February to 28th. And then on 29, the peace agreement was signed. But even the Americans actually are violating, you know, this pledge, this understanding that violence should be reduced. They have been carrying out attacks in Afghanistan, including some airstrikes which have killed civilians. Then the Afghan government is asking for reduction in violence, and now they are carrying out offensives. They have started new operations, and they believe that if they capture more territory, their bargaining position in the talks will improve. Taliban also have continued to launch attacks, and as I said, they are justifying the attacks by saying that there is no ceasefire yet. So I think that every side has been actually increasing violence rather than reducing violence. And that
Mr. Yusufzai, that you are of the view that every side in the Afghan war-torn country, Afghanistan, has been increasing violence and there is lack of trust. That's why the clashes between Afghan government and the Taliban have erupted once again. Thank you for your time at Newswire. Now we are joined by Mr. Hamdullah Hamdard, journalist, joining us from Kabul. Mr. Hamdard, how do you see the clashes which have started erupting once again between the Afghan security forces and the Taliban? How threatening are those for the overall political process, peace process in Afghanistan and the permanent political solution there?
I believe that from one side in Afghanistan, we have the political crisis between President Ashraf Ghani and Dr. Abdullah, and which is hopefully going to be solved, and they will soon agree upon a solution on the political level. The second thing is the peace talks or the peace negotiations with the Taliban. At this very critical moment, if Taliban and Afghan government continue fighting each other and they destroy each other a lot, or like if the war is becoming more disastrous, then I guess this is a little bit dangerous. It might adversely affect the peace talks between the Afghan government and the Afghan Taliban. So they have to, they should reduce the violence against each other. Both should agree on, in principle, to stop the war and to reduce the violence against each other. Otherwise, reaching to a result or a deal through this peace negotiation seems to be impossible in the short term.
Mr. Hamdard, do you think the initial phase of the prisoner release between the two, the Afghan government and the Taliban, would be continuing after this re-emergence of the clashes between the two?
Well, for the moment, Afghan government has denied that the prisoners released by Taliban were not the army officers or not the police officers, and even not the NDAs or National Directorate of Security personnel. And Taliban have said that they were military people. However, the Afghan government continuously says that they were the civilians and Taliban have released them. And at the same time, Taliban have claimed that the Afghan government have released those Taliban whose prisons period was over and they were to be released, and the Afghan government have released them. So here there is a clash of agreement, and there is no agreement here. Taliban and Afghan government probably have a problem of coordination with each other.
So, Mr. Hamdard, you think that there is a problem of coordination which actually owes to the lack of trust between both of the sides? Mr. Hamdullah Hamdard, journalist, joining us from Kabul. Thank you for your time at Newswire. With this, we come to the end of today's Newswire. With more in-depth analysis, we'll be back with you tomorrow. Till then, take good care.